Nelson, thank you for joining us today. The lessons from your classes have had a deep impact how I approach leadership. While you hardly need an introduction for the benefit of broader audience, would you please introduce yourself?
Sure, happy to. So first off, it's great to see you, and there's nothing more gratifying than hearing from former students that are, using some of the stuff we talked about in class in their real lives. So thank you for that. My name's Nelson Repenning. I'm a longtime faculty member at MIT, the Sloan School of Management. I've actually been here my whole adult life. I showed up my 23rd birthday and planning on being here 4 or 5 years and been here ever since, which I think is getting pretty close to 35 years, which is a little bit shocking. And in terms of research, we can probably talk about this more, but I really only worked on one research question, which is basically why don't organizations use the tools and processes that we would all agree are good things to do? So I started that research in R&D and product development environments. I've done a lot of work in high hazard and safety environments, a little bit in hospitals and so on. And so everything I do is really around that question. And the new book I have out called There's Got to Be a Better Way is really my co-authors and my answer to that question, which is how do we get people to be able to use all the knowledge that they have available to them to make their organizations work better?
Yeah. Thank you so much. And congratulations on your new book. I have it here. I really enjoyed reading it, Nelson. Thank you. What really inspired you to write it? And what's the most common leadership misconceptions that you wanted to address through this book?
Yeah, I think there's probably the way that we open the book is with this quote that I will repeat to you because I think it's very illustrative. It was from a manager that we had in class at one point, and he said, I know my organization is in trouble. When I show up in my office early Monday morning, I carefully make a list of all the things I want to get done this week, and then I work my butt off all week. And then on Friday afternoon, I go back to my office and I check my list, and I haven't gotten anything done. And I've taught thousands of executives at this point in my career. And I'd say my experience is that is a very common experience, which is people are very, very busy. They're working very, very hard. They're working all day. They're doing email at night. It's hard to stay away from your phone or your computer on the weekends. And yet somehow it doesn't feel like they're making progress. And if you dig into the underlying psychology, one of the things that motivates human beings is the sense of making progress. And so that's obviously not a great situation for lots of reasons, where it feels like you're putting your entire heart and soul into work and you're just barely, you're barely kind of keeping your head above water, let alone making progress. So that's really the problem that we were interested in. And I think the biggest misconception that we try to debunk in the book is that way of working where you're just kind of frenetically firefighting all day is a good thing, because I think a lot of senior leaders sort of implicitly believe that if everyone's busy and everybody's stressed out, then we have somehow maximized the productivity of our organization. And as we say throughout the book, nothing could be further from the truth. I actually think it's a soul destroying way to work, and it's not particularly productive. And particularly in high hazard environments, that way of working can sometimes lead to some really tragic outcomes that none of us would want. And it's kind of a curious paradox because people who are in those senior jobs were once junior people that worked that way. So at that point, I think they were familiar with the perils, but somehow once you get to the corner office, you kind of forget what it was like, and I think it's a good sign. So, the title is meant to be taken very literally. We do believe there is genuinely a better way to get things done. And that's what we try to outline, is how to get that done in the book.
Thank you, Nelson. Uh, Your research on dynamic work design goes beyond theory. It reflects MIT's motto, mens et manus, mind and hand, by turning ideas into practice. Could you please share examples of where this approach has created real impacts and the lessons leaders can draw from it, Nelson?
Yeah, we have lots of examples. The book is really driven by stories and examples, and I have to give credit to our editor, John Mahaney at Hachette, who really helped offset my pointy-headed academic tendencies. And often, I think his most often written comment on the draft was, "Neat example here." Probably wrote that hundreds of times through the course of the manuscript creation. But I think the example that runs through the book the most is the lead users for us in developing dynamic work design was the Broad Institute. That may or may not be a household name, but it's the institute that grew out of the Human Genome Project. So it started with the first effort to decode the human genome, which on its own took 15 years, and I think cost $3 billion or something like that. But what happened is genomics became a technology. That lab that once had worked on one genome was suddenly doing first hundreds a day and then thousands of these a day. And it really is ushering in a whole new era of medicine where, in the not too distant future, getting your genetic sequence will be an important part of the data your doctor takes so that they can give you a highly customized treatment. When we first met the folks there that ran that lab that does all the analysis work, um, they were in a big mess. They were firefighting like crazy. The lab was covered with samples everywhere. They were in refrigerators. Their cycle times were 120 days. And one of our former students, Sheila Dodge, who ran the lab at the time, her day was firefighting, right? She would run down, she'd reschedule some samples, she'd get an angry call from a customer, she would run back down to the lab, find the samples, put that one at the head of the queue, get another phone call or email, and that was kind of her day. And, and when we interviewed her, she said that I thought that was my job, right? I was supposed to fight all the fires. Um, and using a very early version of the dynamic work design principles, over the course of the first couple of years, they were able to take that cycle time from 120 days down to 20. The utilization on the sequencing machines, which are the very complicated instruments that actually analyze the samples and produce the data, went from they were barely able to keep it above 50% to they averaged well over 95%. A couple years later, they turned their attention to the technology development process and got, a little bit harder to measure, but a 3 or 4-fold improvement there. So really dramatic improvements on every dimension of their operations. And it really helped them go from thinking maybe they should shut down the lab and just do science to now what has become an industry leading position that is, I think, the envy of their competitors. And so that's just, remarkable impact. It's our timing couldn't be better. I was just there yesterday actually signing some books. And so now 12 or 13 years later, to see the progress they've made and the fact that they've stayed committed to this is really quite stunning. And there's one more interesting wrinkle there, which I will share with you, which is early in 2020, when we first learned about COVID, all the universities were shutting down. And so they thought they'd shut the lab down because their customers were mostly scientists at universities. And so if universities weren't doing science, there was really nothing for them to do. So they thought they'd put the shutters on and come back, when the world reopened. But in the middle of March, they got a desperate phone call from a local physician who said, "Do you all know how to do COVID tests? Because here at the local hospital, we don't even have enough capacity to test our staff, let alone the patients." And they sat down and thought about it. And they said, well, we never really returned a test result to a patient, but we have all the technology and we know how to handle samples at a high volume and a couple other things. And so in 2 weeks, they had a COVID testing line that could do a few hundred a day, and then they got to a few thousand. And by the following fall, they were doing 100,000 COVID tests a day and were one of the biggest testing labs in the country. And it was just a remarkable pivot. Now, these were unusual times, to say the least, and I think everybody was focused, but it was for us a really lucky test of the idea that if you use the dynamic work design tools, not only can you be more efficient, which was the initial goal, but it actually creates a kind of general purpose fitness program where you can redirect your capabilities to different sort of strategic foci. And it was just a dramatic transformation and a big success. We've had many other successes described in the book, but that's probably the biggest one. And we come back to that example a couple times over the course of the manuscript.
Yeah, it's truly inspiring, Nelson. Thank you for sharing that. Now, many executives feel trapped in the firefighting mode. And when things go south, it's often very easy to blame people. How can leaders detect early that it's really the system or the process that's failing, and in doing so, create a psychological safe environment for their teams?
Yeah, so this is such a great question. And let me answer it in two ways. First, which is a lot of my early work was dedicated to showing what you just described, which is that when something goes wrong in an organization and you're sort of stuck with the cost of firefighting, you're exactly right. People do tend to blame the people closest to the work for the problem. And it turns out this is rooted into two things. One is there's a basic feature in psychology that's known as the fundamental attribution error, which basically says we have a strong, very hardwired tendency as human beings to blame the person who's closest to the work, right? And you see this in the corporate world all the time, that if a project's not going well, we fire the project manager. Or if a company's not doing well, we fire the CEO. Or in sports, if the team's not doing well, we get rid of the players or the coach or whatever it might be. And again, it's it's a deeply seated bias that we all deal with. One of the things that my work was focused on early on, though, is that when organizations sort of descended into firefighting mode and they started to have troubles, when managers would make that error and they would then blame it on the employees, the really sinister part is that they would then take actions that made the problem worse. So to give you an example, in my sort of thesis research a million years ago, when managers would be unhappy that the engineering group wasn't producing, products on time and under budget, they would then put in more restrictions on their work. So we'd have more meetings to report out, or you'd have more documentation to fill out. But all of that actually created more work for the engineers, right? Because now they had to do their work and fill out the forms and prepare for the meetings and go to those meetings and so on, which then put them in an even tighter bind. And then they would react to that bind by having to take shortcuts. And then when those shortcuts were discovered, because they were quality programs, that would make the managers madder. And so it was just a vicious cycle. And so we coined this phrase, the self-confirming attribution error. And lots of organizations, probably the majority of them, get stuck in this in one way or another. And the result is what you get is a really antagonistic relationship between the folks doing the work and the people leading the work. And then this kind of escalating arms race of, oversight and reports and monitoring and incentives. And, it leads to a very familiar place where people basically hate their jobs. And they hate the people they work for or the people that work for them and vice versa. It's not a happy place. So how do you get out of it? And I think, you asked exactly the right question, which is, if you live in that world as a leader, it's very easy to form a mental model that everyone works for you is lazy and they're not working hard. And I think the best strategy that my co-author Don and I have kind of seen for breaking this is a little counterintuitive, but I think it's remarkably effective. And it's something that we make all our students do, which is go actually see the work. Right. So get out of your office and go to the lab, go to the shop floor, go watch customers being served. We had a student several years ago that was a manager in a Las Vegas casino, and he was frustrated with the check-in process at his front desk. And so he just sat and watched people check in customers. And if you really do that well with open eyes, what you will discover is that the folks that are actually doing the work of your organization are in many cases in a difficult, if not impossible spot, in the sense that the work is so poorly designed and there's so many different things that they have to do that they have no choice but to work around the system to try to get their work done. And that's sort of where the problem starts. So my colleague, Don Kiefer, who I co-wrote the book with, when we give the students this charge, often says is when you go see the work, if you're not embarrassed by what you find, you're probably just not looking closely enough. And I think typically if people will do that and they see how difficult the work is, and then if they start making a few changes to make the work easier, then suddenly all those vicious cycles that you and I were just talking about start to reverse in the opposite direction. You can start building trust. You can start, seeing some results. And then suddenly the conversation between, I think, the leaders and the folks that do the work starts to change pretty dramatically. And I'll just give you one sort of silly example, but it's one that we like, is Don and I are perpetually surprised that even in this digital age, how often faulty printers get in the way of getting work done. And this happened in Don's organization when he was still a manager. And when he finally discovered that this $150 dot matrix printer that they were using to print out the pick sheets in the warehouse was, not working and delaying work, he handed the employee his credit card, go buy another printer, go buy two so we have a backup. Right. But now actually we're making fundamental changes, even though they were very cheap, that help us get the work done more effectively. And once that cycle starts heading in the right direction, I think a lot of really good stuff happens. But it really starts with go understand how the work is actually done. And I promise you, you will learn a lot that you didn't know about how your organization actually works.
Yeah. And thank you, Nelson. It's so relevant. I remember in the classes, we had a full lecture on go see and assess.
Exactly.
So that's the go see and assess concept, right? In large transformation projects, leaders often try to boil the ocean by tackling everything at once, right? In this book, you emphasize the importance of solving the right problem first. How can leaders identify one critical problem to start with and use it to build the momentum?
Yeah, so it's another great question. And there's a little bit of a paradox here. And we dedicate the last chapter of the book because the real trick is to pick a problem that is both important but also then to scope it down, as we call it, and pick a specific manifestation of that problem that you can make progress on fast. And the reason for that is exactly as you say, is that often, let's imagine we have, a manufacturing organization and our problem is maintenance, right? Or an R&D organization and our problem is we need to adapt to AI or some other digital technology. If you're a leader in an organization, there's a very strong tendency to want to fix that problem all at once, right? Which is we're going to kick off a big maintenance initiative, or we're going to kick off a big AI initiative, or whatever it might be. And I have to say that rarely works, if ever. And I've studied this pretty extensively. And the reason for that is it's akin, to imagine a situation where, you're an avid tennis player and I tell you one day, tomorrow I want you to play golf, right? You're going to be terrible, right? And it's not that you're not a good athlete, right? That's just a lot of change to absorb in one setting. And I think for most organizations, particularly if you're publicly traded, although this is probably true for privately held organizations as well, right? If you make this huge change at once, even if it's the right thing to do in the long run, your performance is almost for certainly going to get worse before it gets better. And that can be a very tough sell to your owners, particularly if they are, stock analysts, on publicly traded markets. And so I think the depth that you get when you try to fix too many things at once is just more than most organizations can swallow. And I also think there's some risk there, which is you may know the problem, but if the solution that you pick, that you implement all at once, is the wrong one, now you've taken a huge risk that may not serve your organization well. So what we suggest is pick an issue that's important and then find a small specific manifestation of it. Do as we just talked about, go see the work and start solving the problem incrementally. Pick a small spot, and if you can make some progress there, then draw the circle a little bigger, and then you can make more progress and more progress. And so you proceed incrementally. Now, I will warn all your viewers and listeners, in the beginning, particularly if you're a senior leader, it will feel like you are working below your pay grade, right? You're going to be getting into the nitty-gritty details of the work in ways you probably haven't done for years. But I promise you, even though it feels small and it feels slow, you will learn a lot about how your organization actually works. And it will allow you to scale the solution much more rapidly because, one, you'll work out kind of all the kinks and the mistakes. And there's nothing that helps change propagate like early successes. And so just to give you an example or two, I had a student a couple of years ago that worked at a big semiconductor manufacturer, and he wanted to reduce the time to develop a new semiconductor, which for them was 3 or 4 years, right? It's a big, long process. But rather than, because it was in the context of our project class, rather than fixing that all at once, I suggested let's just pick one piece of that process and let's see if we can make progress on that one. And then if we can shorten that little part, then it'll be easier to propagate. And so he picked a part of the process that is the measurement process, essentially, which is when you have the first prototype of the chip. There's a lot of actually fairly complicated science that goes into measuring it to make sure that it does the things you want. Is it the right speed and power consumption and temperature and so on and so forth. So he picked this essentially 3-month subset of this much larger process, did a really quick hit project, and in the space of about 3 months was able to cut that part of the process from 3 months to a month. Right, got 66% improvement. Right, learned a lot about how the organization works, generated some early results that gave him the street cred to then go pick other parts of the process. But the other part of the story I think is so interesting is he happened to be on the East Coast, but the company had a West Coast operation. And there was a similar project that was in a similar phase that was just maybe a few weeks behind them. He got his measurement phase done in a month. And 3 weeks later, this other team got theirs done in about 25 days. Right. So they beat them. Now, the second project was not part of his project in any meaningful way. But as you all know, the informal information transmission network works very well in most organizations. So, of course, there have been whispers about, what you hear what Project X is doing on the East Coast? Well, we don't want to be left behind. So they've been essentially kind of peeking over the fence, adopting his techniques, just so they didn't get beat. And I think that's what happens when you start solving real problems. It has a real magical ability to kind of both propagate in the organization, and then as a leader, you begin to communicate in a very powerful way. This is actually what matters to me, right? I want people who kind of get their hands dirty and solve real problems and actually make the organization work better, rather than I want people who make a lot of slides and go to a lot of meetings or, whatever the sort of alternative might be.
Yeah, thank you. In this book, Nelson, you outline 5 dynamic work design principles. Could you please share the key takeaways from each of these principles for our leaders, how they can get benefit out of them? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the way to think about it is just a little bit of a preamble. Is sort of the goal in the all the principles is to create work that is self-diagnostic. And what I mean by that is the work itself tells you the next problem as a manager that you need to go solve. And the reason that that's so important is really the big idea that underlies dynamic work design is that, as everybody knows, the future is pretty hard to predict. And no matter how much time and energy we put into it, we're probably not going to get it right. And so if we want to be successful, we need an organization that is able to adapt to unforeseen changes in the markets or the technology we use or whatever. So with that kind of preamble, right, the goal of this is to create an organization that sort of can adapt very quickly and learn as it goes. The five principles are as follows. So the first one is what we call solve the problem right. And the basic idea there is just to use any standard structured problem solving method to tackle the mismatches that you might experience. So when you do the go, see, and assess and you discover a problem, you want to use some kind of simple structured method to make sure that you solve the problem correctly. And another way to think about this is in most organizations that are in firefighting mode, there's a lot of problem solving going on. It's just in some sense below the waterline, right? It's people who are making it look like they're following the budget or look like they're following the strategy when in fact they're not. If you use a simple structured method, hopefully we're making that problem solving more public so that if I invent a new method to do this piece of work, well, then maybe other people could benefit from that. We're very agnostic on the method you use. Many people are probably familiar with Six Sigma's DMAIC, Lean. Toyota has the A3, which we talk about in the book. There's other ones out there. As long as it follows the sort of basic tenets of the scientific method that you learned in the sixth grade, I think any of them are fine. So that's number one. And I think, problem solving in a dynamic world is really the engine of adaptation. So that's sort of the core. Second principle is what we call structure for discovery. And basically what that is make sure that ideally everyone's work is structured so that people can see when things don't go well. This one perpetually surprises me because I feel like this is such a basic element that everybody has. And every year that I teach my project course that I'm teaching right now, I'm always surprised about how many gains people get from this. And the core idea there is it's not very complicated, right? Make sure people are clear on the targets. They understand the intent behind the targets. Make sure they're clear on the activities that they're doing to meet those targets. And that's actually a little harder than it looks because particularly for repetitive work, people are often very unconscious about the way they execute the task. And then just make sure that there's a good feedback loop so that if the activities I do don't generate the result, I get that back to me very clearly. And if you want a metaphor there, I think, the best one is just a well-designed video game, right? Most of you probably have kids that are gamers, right? If you think about a video game, I know exactly what the target is. And when I'm not meeting that target, basically my character typically dies and I got to go back and start over again. And, so I don't love the phrase, but I think the reason you hear the word gamification all the time is that is a good environment for learning because people get such clear feedback about whether they're doing a good job or a bad job. So that's structure for discovery. Third one's what we call connect the human chain. And the basic idea there is if I have structure for discovery, you are hopefully going to discover problems, meaning places where your work doesn't match what the environment requires. The idea behind connect the human chain is let's make sure that we escalate that problem to the person or people who are best positioned to solve it. Interestingly, in physical work, this often works pretty well. So if you think of a factory, or a chemical plant, when something goes wrong, I often know, well, I need to call the shift supervisor or the line supervisor or whatever. In knowledge work, it's often extremely murky who I'm supposed to call when something goes wrong, right? And as a consequence, people will often not raise their hand and ask for help. And so that principle is really a charge to wire together the work so that when there's a problem, it gets to the person who needs to know about it quickly. And I think a good metaphor for that is actually just the fire alarm or the smoke detector you have in your house, right? If I have a fire in my house and I pull the fire alarm or the smoke detector goes off, the fire department doesn't call me and give me a lecture on fire safety, right? What happens is that signal goes to a very specific person, which is my local fire department, and they know exactly what they're supposed to do, which is get in their fire trucks and come put the fire out. After that, okay, then maybe we'll have a discussion about, where the fire started and maybe I need different prevention activities. But I think often in knowledge work, we could really benefit from much clearer sort of fire alarms and people that know, like, okay, if Hassan has a problem and he calls me, I'm supposed to help him come solve that and solve it today. Fourth principle is what we call regulate for flow, which basically boils down to making sure you have the right amount of work in your system. And the easiest way to understand that is we talked a little bit about the firefighting dynamic earlier. The fastest way to get your organization into full-blown firefighting is put more work into it than they have resources to do. And this is something we see over and over again in organizations, which is I think people just tend to overload. And I think the reason for that is actually it's well intended, which is often there's overload because people have lots of good ideas. And when they have a good idea, they start working on it. But the consequence of that is for most organizations, their product portfolios and activity sets look like a, freeway leaving out of the city on Friday afternoon, which is just a huge traffic jam and nothing gets done unless it's a special case. And so we've talked pretty extensively about different techniques to regulate the amount of work that you put in the system. And then the last one is what we call visualize the work. And the idea there is one of the reasons that knowledge work is harder to manage than physical work is it doesn't tend to give you clear signals when something goes wrong. So if you think about a factory, if you have a moving assembly line and a piece of equipment breaks, the assembly line stops, right? You get a clear visual signal that something's gone wrong and people are likely to walk over there and help out. In knowledge work, if you're my boss, I might get stuck on a piece of work, but maybe I don't really want to tell you about it because I don't want to get in trouble, or maybe I'm just going to think about it for a while. And, as a consequence, the information doesn't move through the organization the way it should. We've had incredibly good luck with just giving knowledge work a kind of visual representation. It could be a card and a Miro chart or just a post-it on a whiteboard. And then using that board as a way of just visualizing how the work is moving, or in most cases not moving through the organization. And the conversations that you then have in front of that representation then help you allocate your scarce managerial resources far more effectively. And I think a good metaphor there is just think of the radar screen that air traffic controller looks at. They're not looking at the real planes, they're too far away to see them, but they need some way of knowing where everything is so that they can sequence them and organize them and make sure that there are not too many in there at once. And very simple representations of just what is the work we're doing and where is it can be enormously helpful in having better conversations about, again, where to allocate the scarce resources of you and your team. So those are the five.
Yeah. Thank you, Nelson. I love the way you explained it with metaphors and made it very simple for us. Thank you so much. Even after successful transformation, many organizations slip back into the old habits. From your research on capability traps, what really helps the leader to sustain the transformation and keep the momentum over time?
Yeah, so I think I can answer that in two probably related ways. I think the first answer is, and I have seen this over and over and over again, is people will often, particularly as it relates to the regulate the flow principle, is they will get some discipline, they'll get the right amount of work in their activity portfolios, you'll see the work start flowing. Oh, this is great, our cycle times are falling, our productivity's gone up. But I think if they're not closely tracking that loading, it's easy to backslide into, well, we'll just try one more. And I do this myself with my own work sometimes. Someone will come to me with a project. Well, it's such a good thing to do. I'm sure I can just do one more thing. I'll work on it at night or on the weekend. And what happens, of course, you push the system over its tipping threshold and you're kind of back in the mess. So I think it's very easy, if you're not closely tracking the loading and closely tracking whether the work is flowing, to kind of fall off the wagon and stick a little bit more work in there. And I think many of the clients that we've worked with, will kind of slip off and then they get back. And so they kind of vacillate back and forth. And the second thing I would say is, I think I mentioned I was at Broad Institute yesterday, as it turns out, and they're our lead users. And they have this problem, which is, they come up with a good idea and they kind of think they can sneak one more project in there. And then they see that things start to get clogged up. And then they kind of hop back on the wagon, and they've been through this cycle many times. So I think it's pretty natural. I think the trick is to catch it soon before you've kind of gotten yourself completely back in the firefighting trap. But then I think the other thing that we were talking about yesterday is, because they had been successful and they've grown so dramatically and the environment's changed, they've got a whole new set of problems, right? And those new set of problems require different design. So I don't think the work ever stops. I think you're just solving harder, more complicated problems, or the market changes and you have to, revisit some of the things that you did before. And, that was definitely what they were grappling with. And I think, the trick is to realize that, number one, it's never going away. You're always going to be solving problems and adapting. The world is a very dynamic place. And that's a good sign, right? Because it means that you're being successful. But I do think where people get in trouble is they think, well, okay, I'm done with transformation. Now I can go work on something else. But I think in a dynamic world, that's just not how it works, right? Because the moment you think I got it, some other competitor is going to come and going to change the ball game. So, and another way to put this is, I think in the management world, we have gotten to the place where we think about transformation, I think sometimes in kind of a wrong-headed way, which is we tend to think of it often as a very episodic phenomenon, meaning every 18 to 24 months, we're going to do this big reorganization, and often an expensive consultant's going to come help us. And, we're going to go from business to function or matrix or, some other thing. And I think in a dynamic world, you should think of transformation as something that's happening every day, right? Rather than every 1.5 to 2 years. And so, it's more like a biological model in some sense where we're kind of constantly adapting to changes in the environment. And I think the result is the work is more fun, and you will be leading the pack rather than sort of constantly catching up. But I think the moment you think you're done, you're probably sliding back and you're setting yourself up for some trouble. So
Yeah. Thank you, Nelson. You summarized it very well. You have researched through the system dynamics how overloaded organizations struggle with innovation. In today's rapidly changing world, how can leaders protect the space for innovation and experimentation with changes happening around them while keeping the operations on track?
yeah, another super question, and it is definitely something I've worked on. And I will give you a very practical piece of advice first, and then I'll kind of explain why I think it works. So as I said earlier, overload has just a huge number of negative consequences for organizations. And so I spent probably 20 years of my career, every time I would give a talk, I'd kind of say, make sure you cut your project portfolio in half and do less stuff. And I don't think it had any impact, or it had very little impact. But I've actually changed based on what I've seen at Broad and a couple other places, what I recommend, which is I think the best advice I can give people for that is when you look particularly at your innovation and product portfolios, have the discipline to rank order them. This is number one most important. This is number two most important. This is number three. And then create the culture that if you're on the critical path for number one, I don't want to see you working on number four until one is done. Right. And I think what's doing there is basically what you're trying to do is kind of purge the system of the pet projects and the make work projects and all the little stuff that, tends to creep into product portfolios. And so I think really the key, and it's not easy to do because it means you and your team are going to have to sit down and have in some cases, very difficult discussions about what is the most important project, right? Because the manufacturing people might think that this is the most important. R&D is going to think something different, and customer, service is going to think something different. But if you have that discipline, okay, this is number one, then the work will really start to flow, and it's a kind of backdoor way in some sense of avoiding that overload problem. And essentially what you're doing is you're moving the hard choices up front before people start doing the work where I think they are most efficiently made. And I think the reason that it works so effectively is if you don't do that, number one, too many good ideas will creep into your product portfolio. And then number two, people really start working at cross purposes. So I work on my favorite pet project and you work on your favorite pet project. And then what happens, of course, is nothing gets done. And then people fall behind on their targets. And once that starts to happen, then I think you get the dynamic you were alluding to, which is people start to be very incremental. Like, well, we can just do a little incremental extension on this project because we got to get something out the door so that we hit our targets. And before you know it, your whole portfolio is kind of uninteresting little changes rather than the big breakthroughs that you need. So it works remarkably well to do that rank ordering exercise. And I think part of the reason it works is it creates a culture that gets the work to flow. But I think also it forces a bunch of difficult but necessary conversations that I think the organization probably wouldn't have explicitly with everyone in the room if they didn't do that particular exercise.
Thank you, Nelson. AI is often hyped as a magic fix for one-stop shop for every problem. In this book, you emphasize designing systems where people and processes work in harmony, right? How do you see AI evolving in that context? And how can leaders apply it to build systems that truly empowers people?
So this is another fabulous question. They've all been great. So I have a very specific view of this, and it's motivated by an experience that happened many, many years ago. So back in the 1980s, a lot of U.S. manufacturers got very enamored with automation, right? Robots, essentially. And there's a very famous case where GM thought that by having fully automated factories, essentially lights out factories, that would allow them to compete with the Asian manufacturers like Toyota and Honda. And it turned out that it was a total disaster. The machines welded each other and painted each other and welded the car doors shut. And the automated factories never remotely matched the productivity of the more traditional ones. And estimates vary, but GM lost billions of dollars on this effort. Now, there's an interesting twist, right? You go to a factory today, 40 years later, automation is everywhere, right? So robots clearly changed how the manufacturing was done. So the problem was not that GM had the wrong idea. I think their forecast of the future was correct, which was automation was going to change it. It was the implementation that I think got them in trouble. And so by analogy, what I recommend with AI is exactly what we describe in the book, which is go see the work, understand where the problems are, and start using AI in a more surgical fashion to fix specific problems where AI is a good solution, right? So, work that's highly repetitive that humans don't want to do and humans aren't very good at, that's a fabulous sort of application to it, right? That's a very different strategy than what I hear today all the time, which is we're going to get rid of this entire profession and it's all going to be AI. That may happen in the long run. I just don't see that working in the short run. So I think if you proceed incrementally with a deep understanding of how the work is done, you are much more likely to get the benefit of AI, and you're going to take a lot less risk because, again, you're going to learn a lot about how the technology works and how your organization works. And I'm sure if you and I have this conversation 30 years from now, if we're both still around, we're going to be using AI everywhere. But the companies that I think will get there with the least pain and suffering will be the ones that do it a little bit more incrementally rather than, trying to create a sort of lights out office building or something like that. So,
Thank you. Nelson, thank you for sharing your
nope, thank
wisdom
you.
and time with us. And it's truly an honor to learn from you once again.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's been really a pleasure.